Strategically, geographically speaking, the Middle East is a cross point, historically speaking. You can go back thousands of years, you'll see that this is a crisscross of civilizational activity, trade activities, population movements of a strategic nature, empires being built and ultimately destroyed. So geographically, quite an important region. Israel is a factor, very important factor in the politics of the Middle East. And I'll come to talk a bit more about Israel in relationship to events in Syria and the Lebanon. But Israel is important not only because of its location, but because of its role. What sort of role does it play in Middle Eastern politics? How does its close alliance with the United States affect the politics of the region? Israel being a major nuclear power, let's not forget. The news is about Iran being potentially capable 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line, of being in a position to make a nuclear bomb, while we have Israel, which already has hundreds of nuclear warheads at its disposal with the capability to deliver long-range missiles and so on through its close alliance with the United States. And I add one factor which is, I think, little discussed. There is fear of democracy. That fear is championed mainly by the United States. It sounds paradoxical because the United States appears to be championing an agenda to support democratic forces in the region. Preach democracy, human rights. But really, if you dig a little bit deeper, not too much deeper, you will find that the United States has been an ally of the most reactionary, the most oppressive, the most undemocratic forces in the history, modern history of the region. And really, it becoming a champion of democracy, democratic rights and human rights in the region is, to say the least, a bit obscene, politically speaking. It's a contradiction in terms. If you take every single country in that region, starting with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Syria, we will come to Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Tunisia, you name it, you will see a very close link historically between U.S. political activity in the region and some of the most reactionary, undemocratic forces. The various brutal coups d'etats, practices of these regimes that the United States supported over the decades are really very, very pronounced. We all know about the Saudis and their internal practices. We might know a little bit, at least this is what I have focused on over a few decades now. I'm getting older in terms of the context of Iraq. Saddam's regime would not have stayed in power with its brutal policies, mass murder, and so on, without active support of the United States. In fact, if you look at Saddam's regime, if we include the politics of Iraq from 1963, 1963 coup d'etat, 8th of February, which brought in the politics of mass murder, of torture, of imprisonment without trials, and so on. The Ba'ath Party coming to power in 1963. Saddam was still a young thug, but still a thug active within the Ba'ath Party. 68, he became vice president. And from 63, coup was supported very actively by the United States. In fact, there was a radio station that was transmitting from Kuwait, giving the names and addresses of active Democrats in Iraq, socialists and general Democrats, for Baathists and fascists to go and round them up and kill them. This was actually revealed by King Hussein, the late King Hussein of Jordan. 1963, then 68, when the Baathists came to power again, Saddam became vice president. And when you look at the history of that regime until the invasion of occupation of Iraq in 2003, you'll see that Saddam's most pronounced crimes were committed when he was closely allied to the United States. There were some ruptures in those relations, but he managed to commit his most horrendous crimes while an ally of the United States. If you look at even the invasion of Iran, the attack on Iran that started in September 1980, the United States actively encouraged him because they were fearing the revolutionary situation in Iran. 1979, the Shah regime, which was a close ally of the United States, was overthrown, and there was enormous fear of what will happen to the Middle East, having the Iranian people having toppled a major dictator. And Saddam was encouraged to attack Iran. His chemical weapons, the history of the supply of chemical weapons to Iraq is closely tied to the attack on Iran. He was supplied with chemical weapons, as well as the ability to produce biological weapons. These weapons he got rid of later on, but obviously they invaded Iraq ultimately in 2003 under the pretext of Saddam possessing weapons that they had supplied, they had logged, and they had logged also that he had actually destroyed them. We can talk a little bit about that episode and maybe in discussion. And please give me a warning about the time I'm taking. Yeah, okay. During his attack on the Kurdish people, the use of poison gas against the people of Halabja, the Kurdish people, he was again using weapons that were supplied the United States and major Western powers. If we look at the various dictatorships, Egypt is important, obviously. The Sadat regime, followed by the Mubarak regime, very close allies of the United States. The Tunisian, because we're talking about now the Arab uprisings, the recent uprisings, successive Tunisian regimes, ending obviously with Ben Ali's dictatorship, were very close allies of the United States. If you look at the remaining dictators across the Middle East, Morocco, very close allies, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and so forth. So why did they, for example, ditch Mubarak? Why did they ditch Ben Ali? The United States is much more proactive in a way than Britain in Middle Eastern politics. They did start becoming a bit like a headless chicken in terms of which dictator to support and which dictator to ditch once these uprisings started. They decided to ditch Ben Ali first because of the enormous, spontaneous, incredible uprising in Tunisia, which engulfed the whole country, millions of people. There was no way that any power on earth could save that regime. So they decided to ditch him. And similarly in Egypt, once millions of people go on to the streets, that regime is finished. If you look at the history of various uprisings and revolutions, whether in the Middle East or across the world, if there are tens of thousands of the streets, even hundreds of thousands, regimes can ultimately win, oppressive regimes. But once millions go onto the streets, and once you start, these revolutionaries on the streets start gaining the soldiers on their side, the ordinary policemen go over onto their side, then that regime is finished. And that's what happened in Egypt, that's what happened in Tunisia. So they ditched those dictators. But if you look at the rest of the Middle East, you can see very clearly that the most anti-democratic forces are still in power and they are still supported by the United States. But they did quickly react to events in the Middle East once these uprisings became so pronounced, because they spread quickly to Yemen, to Bahrain, some demonstrations in Jordan, even in Saudi Arabia, and Syria, before, or rather Libya, then Syria. Within a Libyan context, the beginnings of those spontaneous demonstrations against Gaddafi's dictatorship were quickly militarized. And this is to become a very important tactical development, which would acquire strategic importance later on. That the Tunisian revolution, the Egyptian people's revolution and uprisings were primarily driven by millions of people going onto the streets. They were not driven by military forces, by militarized people clashing with the state. In fact, the people reacted defensively. The regime's attempts to crush them were repulsed by the presence of so many people on the streets and by neutralizing most of the soldiers and ordinary policemen. The state was denuded of its power to oppress, to repress, to kill. And within a Libyan context, as soon as the demonstrations started in Benghazi and so on, you could see there was a very rapid attempt to militarize that conflict. And later it transpired, and I wrote a bit about that at the time, that there were actually former Guantanamo Bay prisoners who were released, Libyans, who were released from Guantanamo Bay, handed over to Gaddafi. Gaddafi released them, and it was they who led the first of the military groups in Libya. The attack on the Benghazi garrison was also pre-staged. So the Libyan people were not given a chance to evolve their mass movement against the dictatorship. So the Tunisian uprisings, Egyptian, relatively Yemeni, Bahraini, took the United States and its allies by surprise. In Libya, it was not given a chance, Libya being so strategic in terms of its oil production and so forth. So they succeeded in militarizing the conflict and ultimately justifying NATO's intervention in Libya. Libya today has about 2,000 militias controlling literally each town, each city has competing militias controlling specific neighborhoods. Libya also, as this Algerian episode will show, the attack on the oil refinery in Algeria has its links to Libya. Some of these fighters came over in convoys, apparently from Libya. Details are still coming in, but it's quite apparent now that they did come from Libya. Libya becoming now a center for exporting these fighters. Hundreds of these fighters were significantly exported to Syria. And I need to tackle Syria as something quite important in the region.